I have been also established a YouTube channel. I think this Corona crisis established a good chance for us to meet and dialogue with our students all over and our colleagues all over the world. It's good because in Jordan we still have control under the Corona. We have only about 66 people in the hospitals. We had about 450 some Corona. They have been affected, 9 deaths. So it's under control because the government took very strict action from day one, which means curfews, and did a lot of. We're still under curfew. We're still under strict measures from time to time. But I hope it will come up. It will be soon over. So I hope it will.
Yeah, and everyone, university is closed. You're not having classes.
Yes.
Yeah.
No classes. No school.
Have any anticipated date to reopen?
No, I don't think this semester or the summer. Maybe this summer or the fall. But I have no idea unless Yasser has some idea.
No, I just like you. But most probably, well, we'll have summer also online.
Right.
And there is also speculation that the first semester next year will be the same. We'll conduct it online.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Yes. Well, we have been working from home for 6 weeks, I think, and different American cities are starting to ease the restrictions. Most are telling people they can come back to work about May 8th. I personally think that's way too soon, but
it's true.
You know, there's a lot of pressure to try to revitalize the economy. So we shall see. We are making return to work in the office. We've had everybody working from home, and we're making return to work voluntary. So if you are, if you are healthy, and we've established very strict guidelines if someone comes back in, but it'll be interesting to see how many people feel compelled. I think the people who are single, that don't have family at home, are particularly lonely and isolated. So we'll probably see some of them want to come in, but we're anyone who is vulnerable population, my age, or has a pre-existing health condition, or pregnant, or their partner is a healthcare worker. We're telling them that they can't come in. So we'll go very slowly. We'll go very slowly, but many people are going to rush back, and we'll probably have a second spike, would be my guess.
I think we will have a second wave if people don't behave with social distancing. We're going to have another problem on hand, because this is unforeseen circumstances, which is so sad. Yasser, I think we have about, Professor Yasser, we have about 75 people now.
Okay,
we can start, and anybody who could follow. Please, Yasser, go ahead, Chief.
All right. Welcome you all. Before I give the floor to Professor Kamal Mahadin to introduce our guest, Dr. Culbertson, I would like to say a few words to welcome you all and to salute you for joining us for the 12th lecture we have in our series. As you know, since we launched the series of seminars, it's really proving tremendous success, not only in attracting selecting preeminent practitioners and academicians from all around the world, so in the quality of the that follows, which really makes us happy. to see it coming into fruition, and which gives us assurance that it will be a sustainable platform. I will give the floor to Dr. Kamel Mahadeen to introduce our esteemed guest.
Well, thank you, Dr. Yasser. It's a pleasure always to welcome a colleague and a fellow landscape architect. I cannot speak about Kurt, but his work speaks about himself. I will tell you a little bit. He's the chairman, chief executive officer of Design Workshop out of Aspen, Colorado. And since 1990, Kurt received his BLA from LSU in the 70s, Masters of Business Administration and Real Estate from SMU, and a PhD from Edinburgh College of Art. Kurt is a Fulbright scholar and a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architecture and a fellow of the American Institute of Certified Planners at the Urban Design Forum, and he is also a member of Dumbarton Oaks. He is a past chair of the Rocky Mountain chapter of Young Presidents Organization, and he received the highest medal from the American Society of Landscape Architecture in 2016, which is the highest honor awarded by the American Society of Landscape Architects. But his design firm comes on the top of the few firms that I know of in the States, and he has several branches all over. He has practiced in his firm, I think, in more than 30 countries. And I have got acquainted with Kurt a few years back. And Kurt was instrumental. He was chairing the Honor Society or the Fellowship Council of the American Society of Landscape Architects, and he had been instrumental in giving me the chance to apply for that, which was a dream that came true. I have seen his work. My son, Yazan Mahadeen, who is a fellow architect, landscape architect, had the chance to practice in his firm and joined his firm 3 years ago in Aspen, Colorado. Kurt is a speaker, a professional, and he played an important role in our society in the States and all over the world. It is a great pleasure. I know your time is precious. I know that you'd like always to promote our design profession. I will speak no longer, but I would like to welcome you, Kurt, on behalf of the American University of Manitoba, our team, our colleague, the Faculty of Design, Architecture and Design, from the Interior Design, Visual Arts, and the Department of Architecture. With all due respect, Kurt, it's good always to see you. God bless you. Please go ahead, Chief.
Thank you, Chief. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. I've had the opportunity to visit Amman and visit Jordan on 5 occasions, and always found it to be a wonderful experience, and the people to be very kind and very hospitable. So it's great to be here tonight and to talk to you. What I'd like to do is share with you some means to design, and particularly to a topic that's important to me, which is spatial equity. I oftentimes tell people that when I speak, you know, I think when you listen to a lecture, you assume that you're going to come to hear the answers. I actually use lectures to test ideas, to learn from you as much as you might learn from me. I don't claim to have the answers to this question. Someone told me last week, trying to anticipate what COVID-19 will mean for design is like trying to design an airplane while you're flying in it. We don't quite know yet. Time is a bit early. We need the distance of time and perspective to understand what this means, but it certainly helps to be thinking about it now and anticipating what the possibilities might be. I don't know if you've seen this map before. It was drawn in about 1856 by John Snow in London. It's sometimes referred to as the ghost map. The black dots that you see on the map are the location of cases of typhoid fever that sprung up around the Broad Street pump in London in 1856. It is generally considered the first example of disease mapping in the world. And John Snow is generally considered the father of modern epidemiology. And what's important about this map is that he began to describe the relationship between disease and geography, or disease and landscape. Can you hear me? Come on.
No, I told you there's no map difference. Sorry.
Can you hear me? Okay?
I can hear you. I can hear you, but there are some people sometimes log on the voice. Please, no.
Oh, really?
Some people, they log on by mistake, but yes, we hear you. Thank you. Continue.
Okay, and can you see the slides?
Yes, John Snow, the ghost map. Yes.
Can you see this? Okay. Perfect. Okay. Just checking.
No.
So I began to contemplate what the coronavirus means. What is a virus? I'm not sure I actually knew. It's different from bacteria. Bacteria is an organism, a living organism. A virus at various points in history is sometimes referred to a living organism. We know that it has DNA material, but at this point, it's probably most considered like a chemistry kit. It's something that is dependent upon entering the cells of other living organisms in order to produce. The coronavirus is what is called a zoonotic virus, and by that I mean it has its origins in animals. And it's estimated that roughly 75% of all viruses have passed from other animals to humans, and as many as 60 viruses this century alone, including the Ebola virus, HIV, and so forth. And so many scientists have suggested that it is because of the loss of natural habitat, the destruction of the natural environment, is causing these viruses to seek new hosts, and that we humans are in fact the host that it is now found, and that is why it's replicating so much across the world. As I said, this is called zoonotic viruses. That's why you hear concerns about wet markets and animal markets in China, and concerned that this virus is migrating from these markets into the general public. This book by David Quammen that I've been reading recently talks specifically and anticipates, this was actually written in 2013, I believe, anticipated that the next major human pandemic would be caused by animal infections. As you try to understand, it's in the midst of this crisis, it's easy to sense that, wow, this is the first time that we've encountered such pandemics, and had to contemplate what it will mean for our future urban environments and how it will affect our work, you know. And I found a great saying that disease shapes cities, and it has throughout time. In Athens in 431 BC, it generally considered the evidence of plague in Athens contributed to the decline of Athenian democracy, the loss of Athens during the Peloponnese War. Beginning in 1346 in Europe and throughout the Middle East was the Black Plague, the Black Death, the bubonic plague, and that plague continued for almost 400 years. Generally, a pandemic of the plague occurring every 10 to 20 years with massive loss of life. Haussmann's Paris that you see in the photograph here, the great boulevards, the circles that surround the Arc de Triomphe and so forth, were a product of Napoleon's direction to Haussmann to clear the slums, to to clear the congested areas of the city to make room for light and air in response to disease. The pandemic that caused John Snow to create his ghost map in 1856 in London. In the American South, Memphis, Tennessee, and so forth in 1873, the yellow fever epidemic led to the creation of sanitary sewer systems in those cities and shaped the sanitary city, as it's sometimes called, the idea of public health as a giver of urban form. And then the Spanish flu, again, a global pandemic like we're experiencing now, named the Spanish flu not because it had its origins in Spain, but only because the Spanish were the first to actually acknowledge that they had a problem. Other politicians around the world were trying to keep this flu and the concerns and death it was causing under ropes, as a secret. But that devastated New York and other American cities in the early 20th century. So diseases shape cities, they have through time, and they certainly will again. And we can all speculate upon what that means for our current conditions, but also begin to understand how our relationship between these diseases relate to our own species. Some writers have speculated that Homo sapiens are now an endangered species, right? Others have said that we have reached or passed the concept of peak human, that we have evolved as far as we were evolved and are now on the decline. And other writers have even speculated that Homo sapiens are in fact the disease or the virus that are plaguing the world, and this coronavirus is simply the response of the natural world to the contagion of Homo sapiens. But I want to cause you to pause for a minute and think about your thoughts on evolution, on how we have evolved as a species. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, I think perhaps in the Islamic tradition as well, we all began as a man and a woman in a garden, great place to start, and everything was going quite well until someone ate an apple and then all kinds of things happened. You may or may not believe in evolution, but there are some suggest that we have evolved from the apes, or evolved from ape-like creatures, gradually coming through various species of the genus Homo, until you reach the drawing on the far right, the ultimate evolution of our species, the landscape architect, the most highly evolved form of Homo sapiens. We as a species create. We have made art for thousands of years, right? And we oftentimes like to think of ourselves as better than or separate from the natural world, that God has given us dominion over the earth, and we are either its stewards or simply choose with the planet to do with the planet what we choose. We are builders. We have built throughout time great monuments and civilizations and cities like Petra in your own country of Jordan, right? Or here in Mesa Verde in the American Southwest. But we are not the only builders. Beavers build beaver dams, birds build bird nests, ants and termites and bees build different kinds of structures. So in many ways, we are not so different from our fellow creatures. We are another species, I would contend, in the broader natural world, and not simply separate from the natural world. So what I want to talk about now is a concept that I learned about in the course of my studies for my doctorate, the idea of patch dynamics. The photograph that you see here is from, I also have a home, I'm calling you from Colorado. I also have a home in South Carolina on the American East Coast. It's on the ocean. This is my little cottage here. And what you may be able to see in the foreground are two very large trees that were knocked down during a hurricane. They fell and missed my house by about 2 meters. And this is a hurricane is an example of what you would call an environmental disturbance, something that impacts the environment and sets the entire system into motion and causes change, sometimes good, sometimes bad. A hurricane is a disturbance. A pandemic is certainly an environmental disturbance that sets these patches in motion. I'd ask you to pause for a minute and reflect upon this photograph. And you may not be able to answer me, but I would put to you, tell me what you see, right? I can see patches, areas of natural woodland in light green there, natural forest. I can see rows of pine trees, rows of evergreen trees that are a forest plantation for timber harvest. I can see a grass landing strip for airplanes. I can see a highway, and then crossing across the bottom of the picture, I can see a power line, a utility electric line that crosses through the property. So what you see here are the idea that the natural world, the landscape is comprised of a whole mosaic of patches, different kinds of habitat, and those patches, like the landscape at my home, can be set in motion by a disturbance. Now, one thing that you may find controversial, but and you probably, being in Jordan, may not recognize this map, but I'm sure you have all studied. Some of you have probably seen Central Park in New York. Central Park, in order to build probably the greatest park in North America, the designers and builders forcibly removed a settlement of African Americans, black citizens, who had a village on the property called Seneca Village. They removed those residents in order to make way for the park. And what that suggests to me is that design can also be an environmental disturbance. We like to think that everything we do is for good, but sometimes our actions, if not well considered, can also be for bad. Certainly the creation of Central Park created many, many benefits for the people of New York City, but for the residents of Seneca Village who were displaced by that design action and simply left to their own devices to find homes, this was not a positive impact. So
Dr.
to think
Kirk?
with, yes.
Sorry, I please interrupt you because they're not seeing your screen, neither am I. May you please share your screen? Yes, probably someone by mistake shared theirs. And I would kindly ask everyone to please not share their screen because this will take away from our presenter.
Okay, because it shows that I'm sharing.
The screen is on. You just have to click on the screen that is sharing it.
The screen, sorry, the screen is shown. If you want to see Kurt's presentation, you have to click.
Okay.
Not Kurt. Kurt is doing the presentation, but you guys have to click under Kurt. He has a pen just on his name. Put a pen, please.
Yes, please, everyone. لو سمحت, in Arabic, I'm just gonna say it fast. لو سمحتوا اللي بده يشوف البرزنتيشن بيقدر يروح على ال participants list ويعمل pin للبرزنتيشن تبعت المتحدث. لو سمحتوا ما حدا يعمل share ل his own screen، ما حدا يشارك السكرين تبعته لأنه بصفي عم بيصير في خلطة. شكرا.
Okay, it says resume your presentation. I'm going to click on that and see if that works, okay?
Yes, okay.
Did that work? Resume presenting.
Yes, it is now.
Okay. So, now, this idea of patch dynamics, I think if you have designed a landscape, if you can see this Bull Creek residence, if you've designed a landscape, you've worked with the concept of patch dynamics, right? This is a landscape for a very large home in Austin, Texas. The forest was subject to drought and conditions which caused much of the tree canopy to be killed. We had to begin by removing the dead trees to shape the new landscape, and then to create a planting plan. This is from Millennium Park in Chicago. You can see the patches of different colors of plants, of different types of plant materials. And like you have probably done yourself in creating a planting design, we created a landscape plan, the types of plants we wanted, the colors of plants, the composition. We chose plants that were the colors that the client preferred and identified which would bloom at different seasons of the year. And then we began to install that landscape and hopefully create something that would grow in over time to be quite beautiful. And as I like to say, if you've had a chance to create a landscape or do a planting plan like this, you've probably found, right, that once you plant these plants, they stay exactly where you planted them, right? They stay exactly the way you drew them in your plan. Now I would suggest that's not the way it works, right? Because some of these plants will, for some reason, thrive more than you thought. Some will simply not do well and may die out entirely. Sometimes you may have a drought or rainy season, and different plants will do better than others. So even though you have an idea about the composition you desire, the patches of habitat, the patches of plants are in constant motion. It's a very dynamic landscape, not static. And I would suggest, and this may be a very controversial idea, is that like that planting plan, that cities are comprised of patches of habitat. That a city is not something that exists separate from the natural environment, but is simply a form of habitat, just like the rest of the natural world. This habitat is a type of habitat specifically crafted to needs of one species, Homo sapiens. So throughout history, we as architects and planners and landscape architects have tried to write rules to describe the ideal or the perfect form of cities. This is an image from Barcelona. And if you know the work of Cerda in the early 1900s, late 1800s, he wrote very specific codes and guidelines for the superblock. And it's resulted in a very beautiful city. And I would suggest that our codes, our zoning codes, our architectural codes, in many ways are efforts to try to calm the dynamism of cities, to keep these patches from moving, these habitat patches from moving and changing, and rather to try to lock them in time and space to our preferred model of what a city should be about. Now, if you've studied the work of Ian McHarg, McHarg developed a philosophy and a strategy that he called design with nature. And as I've read McHarg's work and the work of the Scottish geographer and sociologist Patrick Geddes, much of this philosophy was applied to new areas of the city, not the existing city, but what we would call greenfields, areas on the outskirts of the city that were about to be developed, right? This is a project that we did south of Atlanta, Georgia in the United States called Callaway Gardens, a new residential development, urban development. We went through with geographic information systems and mapped all of these conditions, slopes and elevations and habitats and hydrology and so forth, to try to determine the optimum area on this site for the construction of the new development. That resulted in a set of drawings about what the new development should look like, and resulted in a built form that is very similar to what was envisioned and on an area of the site that was optimum for development and had the least conflict with environmental resources. So what occurred to me, though, is that in reading about McHarg, he never took that methodology and applied it to an existing city. And I don't think this is the case in Jordan. There may be some cities in Jordan that are what you would call shrinking cities. But in the United States, we have a number of cities you've probably heard of: St. Louis, New Orleans, Detroit, Cleveland, that are losing population. There's certainly many cities in Europe, certainly in the former Germany, Leipzig, Dresden, and so forth, losing major populations. And 25% vacant land, government owned. They're now government owned, like vacant land, and because the economy has declined, the population has declined, and I said, city, how would that give us help us inform a strategy for shaping shrinking cities, and would it give us a way to bring the ecology back into the heart of an urban environment? So there's a wonderful book, if you've not seen or read, it's called Mannahatta. It's written by a gentleman named Eric Sanderson. And what he did with a spectacular computer graphics specialist is he took old maps of New York City and he georeferenced them. He aligned those historic maps with the current topography of the island of Manhattan, and he created a environmental map, an ecology map of Manhattan Island, of New York City, before European settlement. So in this case, you can see the modern city on the right. On the left, you see what Eric Sanderson and his colleagues suggest Manhattan looked like before the building of the city. And I said, what if we took that same methodology and applied it to St. Louis and New Orleans? What would that tell us? St. Louis, which is in the middle of the United States, about halfway up the Mississippi River, north up the Mississippi River from New Orleans, in the 1300s was home of Cahokia. It was what we would call a Native American settlement. In Cahokia in 1300 was a settlement of approximately 10,000 residents. It was larger than Paris or London at that time in history, right? All of this civilization has now vanished, right? But very interestingly enough, the patch of human settlement population disappeared. So what I did was gather old maps of St. Louis from the very founding of the city. It's about 300 years old now, and georeference those in a geographic information system so I could find out where historic natural features once existed. And then, like Eric Sanderson had done in New York, I created an environmental map of St. Louis pre-European settlement. So this is what the site of St. Louis would have looked like before the French settlers that created the city came, right? And then I also found some spectacular projections of what floods on the Mississippi and Missouri rivers would look like if we had mega floods with climate change and so forth. And what you learn is the site of St. Louis is a spectacular place to build a city from an environmental perspective. It's on high ground, it overlooks the river, it has some natural streams and drainages and forest, but it's really an ideal site to build a city. So why, I said, is it so impoverished? Why are 20 or 25% of the city vacant? Why do people no longer want to live there? And what I learned from studying the works of the ecologist E.O. Wilson, right, who teaches at Harvard, is that there are for many species, for deer, for bears, for jaguars, for lions, and so forth, there are what you call habitat quality models, ways of defining what is optimum habitat for those species and what is poor habitat for those species. And Wilson said that high quality habitat leads to occupancy, poor quality habitat leads to vacancies. And I tried to apply that theory to humans. And I said, well, where do humans want to live? Humans want to live where they have the greatest access to opportunities. And we'll talk about what those opportunities are in a minute. And they want to be as far from risk as they can be, right? So I want to be close to the good things. I want to be far from the bad things. Everything in the middle, I can probably survive, but it's still suboptimum habitat. So I created this model and I said, well, what are those opportunities? Those opportunities are employment, access to transportation, education, access to energy and food. It may be proximity to places of worship or other kinds of cultural resources like museums or parks or open space or great views, right? And design, urban design can in fact improve the quality of the place. So we want to live as close to the green areas, those green factors that are on the right, and we want to be as far from risk as we can be. Well, what are the risks? Well, the risk, if I'm applying McCargian methodology, is I want to be far from geologic risk like earthquakes and so forth. I probably don't want to be close to steep slopes. I don't want to be where a river or a wadi would flood. I want to be away from areas of sea level rise, of tornadoes and hurricanes. And as we know today, I want to be as far away from disease as I can. That's why if I'm wealthy and I live in Oman and I have a flat in the countryside in London, I may have gone to my flat in the countryside or somewhere in the deserts of Jordan to be as far away from the disease in the city as possible. So I want to be as far from geophysical risk as I can. I also may want to be far from social risk, and those could be things like crime. They could be impoverished areas of the city and so forth. And then I also want to be far from technological risk. I don't want to be right next to a roadway with very high dangerous traffic. I don't want to be in an area of the city that has cancer risk or poor air quality and so forth, right? So we have a saying in the real estate industry in the United States is what drives real estate values? Location, location, location. I don't know how that translates in Arabic or you have a similar saying, but in my mind, the real estate market, when it establishes the price of real estate in many ways based on location, the preferred areas of the city are the ones that are close to opportunities like spectacular views over the cityscape of Amman, right? And they want to be as far from these different kinds of risk, right? You hear me okay? Different way to think about it, and I don't know what the best Jordanian example for this would be, as I like to say, you want to live uphill. The preferred location for your home is uphill, upriver, and upwind, right? If I'm uphill, pollution, sewerage, and so forth flows downhill, so I want to be uphill. I want to be upriver because all of that pollution collects and gets more concentrated as it goes down the river. And I want to be upwind. If there's pollution, poor smoke or poor air quality, it's blowing with the wind. And so I want to be upwind. I want to be uphill, upriver, and upwind. If you look at London, if you've had a chance to go to London or know it, where do you want to live in London? I want to live on the West End. Why? It's uphill. The Thames flows from west to east. I want to live upriver. And the industry in London is on the east side of town. Historically, the West End is also upwind from all of the pollution that's created by those industries, right? And so location matters, right? Now, one of the things that the coronavirus has taught us is that there's a great differential in terms of who, at least in the United States, who is catching the virus, right? What we know are that African Americans, Latinos, people of color, as we say in the United States, low-income populations can be 2 or 3 times more likely to catch the coronavirus than white Americans or higher income Americans, right? We know that in part, that's because of pre-existing conditions. They may not have access to good health care. They may not have access to employment. They may have pre-existing conditions like heart disease or obesity. They may not have access to knowledge. They may not have access to the internet, so they can't learn about the disease and what to do about it, right? And so increasingly in the United States, and I think from what I read and what I've observed, this is true all over the world, people are concerned about equity. And by equity, I mean not equal access to opportunities or equal freedom from risk, but fair access to opportunities, fair freedom from these risks. Okay, so we're not trying to suggest that everyone has exactly the same conditions of life, but at least they have a fair and equal chance to succeed. What we would call a level playing field. If you play football, as the rest of the world calls it, soccer, as we call it in the United States, if you play football, imagine trying to defend your goal if you're on the downhill end of this field and you're attacking from the uphill end. It's not a level playing field. And so the idea of equity is about trying to create an equitable opportunity, equitable freedom from risk for all citizens, right? And spatial equity, the concept of spatial equity, is that those opportunities are equitably distributed around the city, that every citizen of Amman can walk to a park in the same distance or ride the bus and get to a park in the same amount of time and with the same amount of safety. That when they go to the park, that the park in your part of Amman is as good as the parks in the wealthiest parts of Amman, right? That everyone has equitable access to these opportunities. And so as I looked at St. Louis, this is a map of St. Louis, the Mississippi River on the right side. I mapped all of the vacant land parcels. There are like 16,000 land parcels in St. Louis that are vacant. And those are the little gray dots that you see on these maps, right? And what you can tell is that those maps are overwhelmingly on the north side of the city, right? North St. Louis. Very impoverished area of the city, overwhelmingly African American, right? But in terms of the kinds of factors that McCarg would have looked at, still an excellent site topographically, hydrologically, and so forth. But for some reason, the vacant land of the city was concentrated on the north side, where there are also people of color, where there's also enormous poverty, right? And what I learned is that throughout history of the United States, there had been a whole number of political acts that disadvantaged African Americans over the rest of the citizens. And certainly slavery in the middle 1800s, that ended in the middle 1800s, had a major factor of that. But there were a whole range of things. In the 1930s, the banks in the United States created maps like this that said where they would and wouldn't lend money. So if you think about the city as a natural habitat, what creates a healthy habitat? It's access to resources, to food, to water, to air, and so forth. And if you, by policy, squeeze off those resources, eliminate those resources, access to those resources from a large portion of the population, they will become impoverished, right? And I won't go through this in detail, but this is a timeline of all of the management strategies by people in the United States, by the people of the United States, by the people of St. Louis, that legislated against the health of African Americans and candidly other populations. Asians in the United States throughout history have also been persecuted, right? And what that resulted in is that if you look at a map of St. Louis today, all of those red dots represent white people living in the city. All of those blue dots represent African Americans, right? So the policies, the governmental policies, which we don't oftentimes think of the physical, geophysical implications, the urban design implications of our governmental policies, have led to racial divides in American cities and dramatically impacted the quality of habitat for the residents. What's curious, and this map is rotated from the one you just saw, is if I then take a map of COVID-19 cases in St. Louis, you can see that the vast majority of those cases are in North St. Louis. Disease follows poor quality habitat. And this suggests, as we reflect upon the implications of COVID-19, this suggests our role as landscape architects is not just to create beauty, which is certainly an important part of what we do, not just to give form, physical form to our cities, but our role is really, it's much more important than that. It is to design quality habitat for the species Homo sapiens. We are the designers of habitat for our species, and the quality of the habitat that we help create has a direct impact on public health and issues like the virus we face now. So I know when I travel the world, I hear oftentimes people will ask me about racial issues in the United States and how did it get that way and what are you doing about it and why is it still so bad? And so I don't want to speculate on what those issues might be in Jordan or other parts of the Middle East. I know from my experiences in Jordan and what I know about your country, it is a very open and forgiving country, a welcoming country. And because of your geographic location in the Middle East, you oftentimes are welcoming refugees from Iraq or from Syria or North Africa like Somalia or Sudan, or you have other religious minorities, be they Christian or Druze or ethnic minorities and so forth. And I would just ask you to ponder for a moment how the presence of those populations have shaped your city. And does spatial equity exist within Amman? Do all of your people have equal access to healthcare, to public parks, to quality education and so forth? Or is spatial equity, this question of spatial equity, a challenge for every city and every population that we should design to? So when you think about this idea of applying Olmstedian or McCarthyan principles to the urban environment, I want to give you some examples of how that might apply to our work as landscape architects. This is a master plan for the Arboretum and Nature Center in Houston, Texas. The idea of restoring these historical ecologies. Again, we took old maps of the city, we geo-referenced them, as I showed you in St. Louis from my dissertation, to create this master plan for the new restoration of the Houston Arboretum. The Arboretum Houston has undergone multiple hurricanes in the last decades that have destroyed major parts of the tree canopy of the city. It underwent a major drought in 2011, which caused the death of many of the urban trees of the city. And the same was true of this property, about 50 hectares in the heart of the city. You can see outlined in dots the number of trees that were killed by the hurricane and by the drought. And our client, the managers of the Arboretum, their initial response was, wow, it's going to cost a fortune, but we really need to go back and plant all of these dead trees and restore the forest that was there. And we said, you know, maybe there's a different way to go about it. Houston sits at the juncture of 3 different kinds of habitats. What they call the piney woods of East Texas, big forest, dense forest of pine trees. It sits on a prairie, a grassland along the Gulf of Mexico, and it exists at the edge of an oak woodland in the hills of central Texas. And I said, you know, the true ecology, the historical ecology of Houston actually had 3 kinds of habitats, not just this pine forest. And maybe we can create a more interesting landscape, a more interesting arboretum and nature center by restoring the site to what it historically would have been, 3 different kinds of habitats, not 1, and creating a much stronger educational opportunity and diverse landscape. And so, as McCard suggested, we went through and mapped all of these factors, slope and topography and soils and watersheds and the strength of the tree canopy. We took those geographic conditions and determined which portions of the site were best suited for the different kinds of landscapes we hope to recreate, restore on the site, the prairie, the swamp landscape, the pine woods, and so forth, right? And we use that to guide a series of alternative plans for the Arboretum, and ended up selecting the one that you see on the right, because that created the most edge condition between the forest and grassland, which created the greatest opportunity for birds and other wildlife. And from that master plan, we began to illustrate what these habitats would look like, and then to design and build the new Arboretum, where you can walk through the bog landscapes, walk through the piney woods, and begin to discover nature again. So the idea of going back to the pre-settlement conditions, certainly much harder in Amman, which is thousands of years old, but really to understand, as you saw in St. Louis, the underlying environmental conditions like we've done in Houston, and use that to a guide for landscape development of the city. To think about how parking lots and pathways can be built with porous paving and different techniques to match the natural environment. In a similar way, we've been doing the park system master plan for Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada. And there, the park board asked us, the people that administer the park system, asked us to define spatial equity. And we looked at 3 general conditions. One is access. How easy is it for every citizen to walk to the park? Can they get there by public transit, by bus or train or so forth? What is the quality of the park? Because a park in one neighborhood might be the same size as a park in a wealthy neighborhood, but the quality of the improvements may vary dramatically. And then there may be other barriers to access, price of admissions to certain activities and so forth. And we began looking at the original park system plan from the 1920s of Vancouver. The typical way to do that was to draw circles for a 15-minute walk from the city and put a proposed park in the center of each of those circles with the hopes of covering the entire city with parks that were in easy walking distance of the population. But this kind of analysis really doesn't consider barriers like major roadways or railroad tracks or utility lines and so forth. So we began to use geographic information systems to map what the true walking distance was to different parks within the city to identify gaps. And then we also looked at other things. Where is the demand for low barrier or low cost recreation? If you are a wealthy resident of Amman, you may have a very nice garden at your home. You may have a swimming pool in the garden of your home. You may have the money to join a private health club, right? If you're a low income resident, you don't have access to those kinds of facilities. So there's greater demand for recreation in the low-income parts of Vancouver than in the wealthier parts of Vancouver. And in a similar way, if I own a large home in Amman, I may have a lot of trees and a big garden. So I have more of an urban forest. In the wealthy parts of the city, I have almost no tree canopy in the poorer parts of the city. So rather than simply say we have, you know, everybody gets the same thing, we say there may be a logic to spending more money to creating greater priority on serving those parts of the city that are currently underserved by parks and trees and so forth. And that created a guide for public officials to determine where their investment should occur in new parks and park improvements. And to create what we called a 100-year vision for Vancouver. And we chose 100 years because oftentimes really bold ideas, if I'm an employee of the local government and I say, oh, that's too controversial, I don't want to deal with that, I only have 5 more years to my retirement or 10 more years to retirement. It's not a bad idea, but I don't want to have to deal with it, you know, address that later after I've retired, right? Or if I'm an elected official, I'm on the city council or I'm the mayor, I say, you know, it's a good idea, but it's going to be controversial. Don't put that idea forward during my election term, right? Or if I'm the finance manager of the city, that you say, oh, that's a great idea, but there's no way that we can afford it. And so big, bold ideas are oftentimes thrown aside for political reasons or financial reasons. But if you say to someone, here's a really bold idea, something we think we ought to do, and we think we can get it done in 100 years, then suddenly everyone says, oh yeah, you know, as long as I don't have to deal with it during my career, you know, at the city government, go ahead, you know, that's probably a good idea. Or someone said, as long as you don't put that idea up while I'm running for election, sure, go ahead. And the finance minister said, well, you know, I can imagine in 100 years we might have the money to do that. Sure, go ahead. So we have begun to put forth these idea of the 100-year plans because we believe that that's the way to accomplish the really bold ideas that are required to change cities. Now, in the United States, we're also dealing with many areas with sea level rise. This is a master plan on the coast of South Carolina. We've mapped in the landscape different income and economic conditions. You can see the third map, the areas where people of color, African Americans principally, live within the county. We've overlaid that over maps of floodplains and so forth. And what you find is the wealthier people, generally white people, live on the high ground against the ocean. So they have great views, but they have the least risk of being flooded. The lower income population, the people of color, are often in the lower elevations, the areas that are subject to flooding. A friend of mine refers to this as what he called racialized topography, right? And so, and if you then map COVID-19 cases, what you also find is that COVID-19 cases, as in St. Louis, occur in the poorest quality habitat for Homo sapiens, the lower ground that's subject to flooding, the lower ground where disease may become more prevalent. So again, habitat quality determines the impact of disease. And then we've been working now in Los Angeles. If you've read much of the literature about COVID-19, air quality has a direct impact on your susceptibility to disease. The poorer the air quality where you live, the better chance of you catching the virus, right? Because your immune system has been weakened. We've been working in Fontana, California, the area you see outlined in white, developing an urban greening plan, a landscape strategy for the city, looking at a range of characteristics, again, tree canopy, urban heat island, environmental pollution, access to bike networks and pedestrian networks, right? And comparing the tree canopy in Fontana to other cities in the Los Angeles area. You can see in Fontana, which is a largely Hispanic, largely Latino community, less than 1% of the surface of the city is covered with trees. If you lived in Beverly Hills, you've probably heard of Beverly Hills, probably the wealthiest area in all of California. Almost 27% of the land area of Beverly Hills is covered with trees. So tree canopy, the amount of tree coverage you have in your city or in your neighborhood, is very highly correlated with wealth, right? And so we said, rather than simply greening the city from a beauty point of view, could we use trees in a scientific way to improve the air quality of the city, right? And what we learned is that not all trees are the same. You're probably reading a lot of articles now that says, well, we could plant 1 million trees or 3 million trees. We could improve the air quality in the world. But some trees are better at sequestering, some species of trees are better at sequestering carbon than other species. Some tree species are better at capturing particulate pollution. We say PM 2.5, PM 10, capturing particles of pollution, right? And many trees emit volatile organic compounds. Many trees actually produce chemicals that lead to poor air quality. So not every tree is in fact good for the environment or good for air quality, right? There's a preference for certain kinds of trees over others, right? And so we began to set targets for increasing the size of the tree canopy. We helped to try to quantify the impact of different types of species on different on air quality, and create a strategy for improving green streets throughout the city, and defining landscape standards for different kinds of land uses, be it commercial or industrial, and schools and public facilities as a guide to improving the landscape of the entire city, and then illustrating what those improved conditions might look like. So COVID-19 requires us, or offers the opportunity, if you will, to imagine a better world. Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago, said, never waste a crisis, right? And so we have the opportunity now to consider what we might do. We know that disease shapes cities. We know from history that disease shapes cities, but how might we change it in a way that makes us less prone to disease? You may have seen this proposal online, Parc de la Distance. It's by a landscape architecture studio in Vienna. It suggests a park entirely divided into 2-meter wide walking paths and separated by green hedges. So we can all go to the park, walk through the park, and maintain social distancing. It is a very clever and brilliant idea at a certain level, but hopefully, as you saw from the previous slides and talk, it really doesn't get at the systemic problems, the system-wide problems that lead to disease. It really gets at the tactics for dealing with the disease once it's arrived, right? A number of cities, Berlin and Bogota and Colombia and New Zealand, and Oakland, California, here in the United States, are increasingly using the opportunity, the reduction in automobile traffic caused by the pandemic, to reclaim public roadways for pedestrians and bicyclists, right? To eliminate roadways. New York, I was reading this morning, has proposed the elimination of 174 miles of roadways within Manhattan just in the last week. Some have speculated that landscapes may move indoors. If we can't all be out in large crowds and in the public because of these pandemics, will we see a greater emphasis on interior landscaping and so forth? Wonderful realization that in the cities of the world that bird life is returning, that we wake up and hear bird sounds like we've never before. If you know that if you can hear birds on a Wednesday, like you typically hear birds on a Saturday in Amman, you know that's something different, and it's a wonderful change. Can we begin to design soundscapes for the reduction of noise in our landscape, like you see here for the design of the airport in Amsterdam? And then Most importantly, can we reconsider the relationship between Homo sapiens and the rest of the natural world? Can we talk about the design of ecology of the city? You may have seen in Oman, or you may be reading articles about how wildlife is returning to cities all over the world, how nature abhors a vacuum. Nature hates a vacuum. And as we as Homo sapiens have all moved indoors, we have retreated from the rest of the urban habitat, and all kinds of creatures are moving back into the city. And I suspect that they're here to stay. And there's a great deal of evidence, another book I would recommend, that scientists are finding that wildlife in the urban habitat are continuing to evolve. They are adapting to the new habitat that they find, and that the urban condition is shaping the DNA of these various species. And if that is true, the urban environment is also shaping our own DNA. So in summary, I would say we need to do a number of things. We have to, as we always have as landscape architects, protect the natural environment. It's the disturbance of the natural environment that has in many ways led to the spread of these zoonotic viruses like COVID-19. We have to view our work as the creation of quality human habitat. Our charge as landscape architects, is to design quality habitat for our species. We have to work both tactically, like you saw in the Viennese example of park distance, but also systemically to design healthy cities. We need to bring healthcare science into our work. We need to provide habitat, quality habitat for those less fortunate, the homeless and people in need. We need to ask the spatial equity question on every project, right? As they're doing in London and New York and other cities, we need to expand the public realm, take back our streets from cars, give more of that space to bicyclists, to pedestrians, bring back the public realm so there's more space for humans to move, to maintain social distance in these times. We need to understand how pandemics might impact park design. You may have read that in the parks of New York, they've set up field hospitals. As you saw in Fontana, California, we need to design for air quality, to improve the quality of habitat and reduce susceptibility of disease. We need to capture what we now enjoy, the return of bird life and natural sounds to our cities, designed for noise attenuation, and we need to envision the future cities, the equitable cities that we desire, and to fight for them. So in closing, I would like to leave you this quote. You may have heard of the great American civil rights leader, Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King often used this quote, and it's the idea that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And this is the idea in my mind that we are in a continual struggle, a continual battle to create a just world for all of the citizens, right? And that our search for that moral universe will take a long time. It will not be a straight line. We simply don't go from here to there to create a just world, but very positively, very optimistically over time, that arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. So with that, I thank you. And if there are questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you, Kurt. I leave it to Claudine to manage the session, please. Claudine?
Thank you, Dr. Kurt, for such an enlightening presentation.
Pleasure.
We will open the floor for questions and answers. Please, whoever would like to post a question, just write on the chat, or if you'd like to stay to have a turn. Thank you, Dr. Kurt. We have a question from Mohammed Sadi, followed by Maha.
Okay.
Yes, Mohammed Sadi, may you please unmute your mic and kindly ask your question. Mohammed Sadi, I'm guessing there's a problem with his microphone, but he posted his question on the chat.
Yeah, I just saw someone ask the question about whether we see more interior spaces, for example, right? That's one of the ideas that's put forth, is that if we find the idea of being out in crowds and being out in public spaces where there are a lot of people, and we can't maintain social distance, right, from a health point of view, will we see more emphasis on interior landscapes, interior gardens? I think that's a tactic. You know, if you know the difference between, think about the difference between tactics and strategy, that doesn't strike me as a practical solution for the entire city, but it could be used whenever possible, right? So I suspect we will see some greater emphasis on interior landscaping, but I'm not sure that that fundamentally solves the system-wide challenges that disease presents.
Okay, great. And then we have
try to grab them real quick. I'm happy to send you my contacts. I think Dr. Mahadeen has those. So.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank you for this amazing lecture. We've all learned so much. And second of all, I'd like to apologize from all of us for the spamming that was going on earlier. Thirdly,
not to worry. It's a crazy world out there. I don't worry about it.
Okay, so my question is about what you mentioned earlier about as a strategy towards the coronavirus pandemic and everything. You said that they were looking into interior parks, sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you elaborate more on that? How that would look exactly, and how it would help exactly to have sort of crowd gathering inside as opposed to crowd gathering outside?
Yeah, I think that's the point, right? Is that people are saying, well, if I go out now, right? If I go out now on a public plaza or a public street, there are too many people, and I can't be 2 meters apart from them. I can't maintain social distancing, right? So someone says, hey, well, one idea is we'll take the block of my building, you know, my block that I live in, and we'll have a garden that's interior to my block. And so only my family and my immediate friends, or the people that live immediately around me, we can share that green space, right? Well, I think that's, you know, it's a nice idea, and if someone can make that happen, it's probably fine. You would still have the same social distancing questions.
Mm.
I suppose you could argue, I think we can afford it, or some people that have the forethought to create those interior gardens. That will probably happen in some cases. You know, it already happens now in some cases. But I think at the end of the day, one of the things I've found for all the people that work with me, for all my neighbors, is what truly social creatures we are, right? That we have to be around other people. We have to be out in public. We have to see our friends and family and so forth, right? So if you recognize our fundamental nature as humans, we want to be out with other people. So we have to find a way to beat the disease, you know, and be able to be back in public with our family and friends and with the larger world again. But it would sure be nice to have much more public realm, right? Wider sidewalks, places to bicycle, more park space and so forth. So if the pandemic returns, we can still be outside and maintain our social distance, right? So there'll be lots. I suspect we'll see a lot of little tactical ideas about things you could do. But the bigger question is, what's the big strategy to help create healthier, more equitable cities, right? Not focus on the little tactic, but what's the big idea? The systems that we need to work on. So then we can do both systems and tactics.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Well, Claudine, if you allow me, I think Professor Naif Haddad has joined us. The Dean. Is Naif with us?
I see him.
Naif, are you
He's
with
there.
us?
He's got his microphone muted.
Yeah, I have his microphone.
Naif, he hears me. If Naif is here, let him say a word or two. It would be nice. Naif, how was the meeting, the Dean's Council and all that stuff, you know? Naif. Maybe he's putting it new. Hassan Mahdi is presenting. Shut him down. Whoever is doing this. Anyway, I have a question. Kurt.
Yes.
Thank you for an excellent lecture. Outstanding, especially it comes up with this crisis of the COVID-19. We are now with this distance learning, and I think it gives us a lot of opportunities. I think we have a new wave of our environmental planners or landscape architects coming up on the scene to make a new, I think things, do you think things will change into a new era after COVID-19 for us planners and landscape architects and architects?
Well, I think it's going to change in a lot. It's going to change in a lot of ways. You know, we've had 130 people working from home for 6 weeks, it's going to change the way we practice. I think it'll be much more distributed. People will be able to work from home, from their cabin in the desert. So spatially, we'll be much more distributed in the way we work. I was going to tell you, Kamal was emailing this morning about a couple of things, and he's in a small village in China, staying away from the disease. I'm going to send you his email now, so you ask him to give a lecture from this small village. So I think these kinds of opportunities, like we're having now, we're all going to learn how to better connect digitally, collaborate across digital platforms around the world to solve problems, Maybe have you sit in on a design review of a project in the United States, and I can sit in on a design review on a project in Oman. And then I think we're obviously going to see much more emphasis on design for public health, to think through the tactics of how we prepare for the next pandemic or the next wave of COVID-19. How do we, if that comes back in the fall or again next year, what is the kind of, we say pop-up, what are the pop-up solutions that we could put in place to improve health conditions, right? Some cities, New Zealand, they've gone out with paint and simply taken a lane of traffic away and painted it blue to turn it into a bike path overnight. If you have enough blue paint, you could probably do that in Oman in the morning. You could all get together and make a new bike path. So I think we'll see a lot of those kinds of solutions. Yeah.
Great. Naif, are you there, sir?
Yeah. Welcome, Professor Kurt. I have a Dean's Council, but it is recorded and I can enjoy your lecture. Sorry, I can't be with you. It's our pleasure to have you. But sometimes in what we call Corona, but I called it BC. It is now before Corona and after Corona. So
yes,
we had a Dean's Council, and before 5 minutes we finished. And I joined you. It's our pleasure to have you, and we believe that we will have in future collaboration with Dr. Mahadin. And it's nice that he invite you. It's our pleasure to have you. But I promise that I will see your lecture, because the title is very interesting. But I couldn't. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to it. Next time you have, I know these Dean's Council meetings are a lot of fun. So the next time you have one, tell me and we'll schedule another lecture.
Okay. Thank you.
Kurt, I would like to, before we may have one more question before we leave. I would like you, if from time to time, I hope this COVID thing or Corona will go away, but meanwhile, if we have a jury or a couple of juries with our graduate students,
it would be
nice to join us, because there are a couple of projects. Dr. Yasser is in charge of the graduate team, our department chair, and it would be nice to share, because some of the people are working
in the final jury.
landscape issues.
Yeah.
You know, it would be
No,
really
that would-
nice. And another thing,
That would be
maybe during your
I was going to
your
say, we have
trips,
a
you know,
young man that works for us in Aspen named Faraz. And Faraz went to school and grew up in Ohio, but his family is originally from Oman. And I think Faraz would be thrilled to be able to participate with the students there. So I'd love to include him moving forward.
That would be nice. That would be great. Claudine, let's have a final question and then we'll end it up with Yas. Okay?
Yes, we have a question from Omar Ahmed. Omar Ahmed, may you please unmute your mic and ask your question because he's been waiting for a while. If he's not there, then Omar Ahmed, yes, please, may you please ask your question? And maybe we have another quick question by Ibn Majid, but please make your questions very, very short.
Yeah. Thanks for the lecture. Sorry, Omar is here, so it's okay.
Yeah.
Omar? It's okay.
Thanks for the great lecture, Dr. Kurt. I have a quick question, please. How far do you think this whole situation with the COVID-19 and the social distancing is going to affect how we design as architects and landscapers? Especially we are, as human beings, we are social.
How do I think social distancing will affect? You know, I think it's too early to tell how social distancing will affect us. In part, you know, it seems that every government has landed on the idea that we need to be 2 meters apart minimum, right? On the other hand, I've read some scientific studies that say if you sneeze or cough, you know, the virus can be transported 8 meters or more, right? And so I think that having everybody separated by 8 meters was physically impossible. So, you know, I think government simply arrived at a separation distance that seemed feasible and workable that people could actually adhere to. But I'm not sure that the 2 meters that we're using for social distancing now is real closely tied to science. It's sort of a political number as much as a scientific number. So I think that, you know, as I mentioned early on, it's like we're trying to design the airplane while we're flying in it, right? We know exactly what the design parameters need to be, and it's going to change as we have more and more science to understand our knowledge of this particular virus, right? The bigger question is there a way to think about this? We had Ebola virus, we had others. How do you design healthy cities? How do you design healthy cities in general? Not suddenly running out and saying we have to design all of our spaces so everybody meters apart. That'd be relevant for COVID-19, but it might not be relevant for the next virus that comes in 5 years or 10 years or whatever. So we have to design healthy habitat that ensures the public health for everyone, regardless of the kinds of health issues we have. Does that make sense? Hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Dr. Kurt. I think
another
that
question
also answers the Jane and Zain's question because they were asking about the same thing. Ibn Majid, if you have a different question, may you please unmute your microphone and ask it before we move to Dr. Yasser.
Yes, please. Hello, I'm Mustafa. Thanks for a nice lecture. Actually, my question is, since this pandemic affects not just locally, do you think we should have an organization that makes sure all the cities applying that standards or creating new standards and making sure that cities applying these standards? I think it's because of its effect is not just locally. So do you think it's a dream, or we can create that organization? Thanks a lot. Appreciate your help. Thanks.
Well, that's a really good question. And what strikes me is I'll make an observation about green building certification systems. Okay, so if you think about LEED, U.S. Green Building Council in the United States, ESTDAMA in the UAE, right? Those, we already have organizations that define sustainability councils or standards, right? They define sustainability standards. But at least in the United States, and from what I've studied about ESTDAMA, they deal with environmental questions only. They deal with water conservation or energy conservation, or the kind of landscape you use, or the kind of building materials that you use, right? So we already have multiple organizations around the world to deal with sustainability and standards for sustainability. It would seem to me that perhaps rather than another organization, it could be that those existing organizations could expand their standards to include standards for public health, right? So if I'm designing a green building in Jordan, have I considered water conservation and energy conservation, and have I included provisions for mechanical systems, air handling systems that reduce the dispersion of viruses? Or is the landscape designed so it anticipates some of these social distancing questions? So I think in that way, where I already have existing institutions in place, I may simply improve what they do rather than create an entirely new organization. But a new organization might be appropriate, but it would seem to me it might be quicker to simply expand the definition of what constitutes sustainability and adjust standards accordingly. One idea.
Thank you, Dr.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Kerr.
Thank you.
Now, due to the shortage of time, we will move to Dr. Yasser.
Okay.
Dr. Yasser?
Okay. Thank you for a very illuminating talk. I have a small question which was really raised by a comment or by a reflection that you shared with us about the issue of densification, and and the question as to what is a better model for future urban the city, or continuing with the horizontal expansion, because these choices are in Jordan are really very crucial because as far as the issue of horizontal expansion, Amman, for instance, among other Jordanian cities, suffered from following this model, especially with the cost of encroaching on the agricultural land,
right?
And the stemming pollution, car pollution, vehicular pollution, and other environmental risks that you just cited. Of course, the opposite alternative, which is the densification of the city, is being also rendered questionable in the light of the recent pandemic. The question that poses itself is if there is a third choice, which I may reluctantly label as smart densification, whereby we can reintroduce ecology to the dense urban fabric, both in terms of intervention which on the legislative level allow for some kind of greener neighborhood within taking into consideration the density, allowing for types of vertical, for instance, vertical gardening,
right,
on the one hand, and on the cultural level, where people perhaps, and we're starting to witness this in Amman as well as in the other part of the world, where people are changing their mode of behavior.
Yeah.
Maybe if we take into consideration these two factors, both the behavioral, the cultural behavioral, and the urbanistic, we might really witness a new form of urbanization, which is more friendly ecologically,
yeah,
and as well as socially.
Well, I think that's where we have to go, right? Because one of the things, at least in the United States, right, is many of the people that are getting this disease have no housing, right? They're living on the street, right? They have very poor quality habitat in terms simply of there's no place to get out of, get away from poor air quality, or they're sleeping on the street, right? And if you go to a horizontal model, you know, you have more automobile use, you have more consumption of land, you have much more expensive development, which means housing is going to be available to fewer and fewer people, right? So that's why the people that are crying for, oh, we have to get away from density, I don't think that argument makes sense, right? And so I think in order to provide opportunity for everybody, to provide housing for everybody, we're going to have to live in denser cities, right? But we have to do it in a new way. We got to do it in a new way with green walls, with vertical gardening, with agriculture on the tops of buildings, with better air quality, better water quality, and so forth. And so I think that that's a big debate right now. You know, our government is lowering the standards for air quality that's required from industries, right? At the same time, they're trying to fight a pandemic that's made worse by poor air quality, right? It's madness. It's simply madness, right? So I think we've lived in cities for 10,000 years or more, right? I think we're always going to continue to live in cities, but we have to learn how to make better, more sustainable, greener cities, right? I don't think we're all, you know, I don't think we're going to be living, you know, 100 kilometers from Amman, coming into work every day. So, good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good conversation.
Thank you, Kurt. You've done a good job.
Thank you,
Claudine,
sir. Thank you, Chief.
The chair. Hope to see you in Amman soon, or see you in the States.
Absolutely.
And good luck. You have enriched our evening. As always, Kurt, it's a pleasure to see a colleague who is doing an excellent job.
Okay, I have two things to say. One, yes. I'm going to send you the email of your next lecture.
Thank you.
Congenu.
Thank you.
And go Tigers. Go Tigers.
Go Tigers. By the way, Kurt is a colleague of mine. We graduated from the same school. But yeah. One thing, Kurt is but very few people have broken the record of Kurt, by the way, when he was at LSU. Kurt, it was a pleasure meeting you tonight.
You.
On behalf of the president of the university, the dean of our college, Naif Haddad, and the team, and Sam, thank you, of the faculty. Claudine, you've done a good job. Thank you.
Yes, Claudine, thank you. I look forward to seeing you in Amman soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Anytime.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night or good day.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.